Shana Tova. A few years ago, when my kids were young enough that I got to drive all three of them to school in the morning, they posed a question to one another as a game. If you won $10 million in the lottery, what would you do with the money? They were little and they were cute, so they shouted out answers like, I'd buy a race car, or a pony, or I'd buy a rocket ship. Eventually, they remembered that I was in the car with them driving, and they turned their question to me. Dad, what would you do if you won $10 million in the lottery? I didn't have to even think about it because I knew the answer in my soul. I would take every single person at Temple Emanu-El, the entire congregation, to visit Israel. And it's true. If I could, I would. Because I so strongly believe that a guided cultural encounter with Israel is nothing short of profound when it comes to creating Jewish identity, especially for teenagers who are pulled in a million different directions. Teens who travel to Israel see doorways for spiritual growth that will serve them for the rest of their lives. They become, most of the time, adults who put time and effort into their Judaism and who care deeply about the Jewish people. I'm a prime example. Judaism wasn't strong in our home growing up, and my Jewish identity was tenuous at best. Despite this, or maybe because of it, my parents sent me to Israel as my bar mitzvah present with my best friend's family on their synagogue trip. The trip was too expensive for the whole family to go, and at that point, my parents hadn't yet been, but they could afford to send me, and so I went. Looking back, that trip and my experiences set the course for my life, my passions, my calling, my career, how we're raising our children. I'm not alone in this. The journey towards Israel began in the Torah as our spiritual legacy. Only 10 generations after Noah's flood, our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, are living in the land of Haran, modern-day Syria. There, they have a comfortable existence, but they're destined to be part of a much bigger story, one that would change the world. God called them with the words, Lech lecha, lechi lach, take yourself forward, me'artzecha, from out of this place where you're comfortable, El haaretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. God tells Sarah and Abraham that as they travel forward, there'll be a blessing. They will be a blessing and partners with God to transform the world from what it is, a place of brokenness, to what the world ought to be, a place of wholeness, health, and justice. On Rosh HaShanah, we are called to be courageous and to take inspiration from our ancestral narrative. Our sages are quick to point out that the Hebrew construct of Lech Lecha is both an imperative and is reflexive at the same time. So it's a command to take ourselves forward, but in doing so, we're also commanded to take ourselves inward. That physical journey also becomes a spiritual one. The journey isn't to a random place, but rather to a place that Abraham and Sarah had not yet been, the land which today we know as Israel. Since Jewish time began, the journey to Israel has been an existential and essential yearning for our Jewish identity. And I believe that every one of us is still being called to make this pilgrimage today. For thousands of years, since the destruction of the Second Temple, Jews all over the world pined and prayed for the chance to return to the land. Hundreds of Jewish generations could only dream about what we're able to do today. 75 years after the recreation of the Jewish state, to hop on an airplane, and hours later, be in that place where our ancestors walked and where today live more than half of the Jews in the world. So you can imagine the excitement that I felt when congregant Ed Schiffer asked me a version of the question my kids had posed years earlier. Over a cup of coffee at Crema, Ed wanted to brainstorm some ideas about where a significant gift at Temple Emanu-El would be most impactful. My answer was ready. Let's take them to Israel. Not the whole congregation. We're not talking about that much money. But we could bring the ones who would benefit most at the right time in their lives, our teens. Thus, the Schiffer Teen Israel Adventure was born. A chance for our 16-year-olds, our Sunday school confirmation class, to travel to Israel with their TE friends and their rabbi. A 10-day trip designed to have them tap into their Judaism, deeply engage with the complexities of Israeli society, and fall in love with both the country and her people. I'm proud to say that Ed Schiffer has set up a fund to ensure that this trip is available every other year in perpetuity, meaning that every single kid at Temple Emanu-El will have a chance to go to Israel. You are all welcome to contribute to this endeavor. As far as I know, we're the only synagogue with this type of subsidized program in the country. This past June, I led the first trip with 27 teenagers from Temple Emanu-El. I have to say, in all my years of being a rabbi, that it was the most meaningful experience that I had. The trip was a wild success. The kids really bonded. They bonded with the country, they bonded with one another. Each day brought us deeper into Jewish history, both ancient and modern. We got to see the immense challenges that Israel faces today. And every one of our 27 teenagers discovered an authentic feeling of belonging to the Jewish people. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that that was going to happen. Your rabbis put a lot of thought and intention into how the kids might engage with the country of Israel and not just the myth. We needed the kids to be open, to challenge their own assumptions about what Israel was and was not. So, when we arrived in Tel Aviv after a long overnight flight, with everyone sleep-deprived and jet-lagged, we took the kids dancing. Not to a club or Israeli folk dancing, but rather to the famous Gaga Ballet Studio. Our group had a private space overlooking the Jaffa port, where we were led by a young man with tattoos and a nose ring. He had us shaking and spinning, twisting and turning around the room, each of us interpreting his instructions differently, inventing our own rhythms. And here's the kicker: this was all done without any music. Does a room full of teenagers being asked to dance without music in front of one another sound awkward to you? You're right, it totally was. There was a lot of giggling and laughing. Twice, the instructor had to stop us to insist that we refocus. But eventually, as a group, we got it. At the end of the hour, we sat down in a circle, and I asked the group why they thought we'd started our trip in such an unorthodox fashion. Their answers were spot on. That I wanted them to get out of their comfort zone and to learn to trust one another when they were vulnerable. That I wanted them to interact with a secular Israeli who was passionate about alternative Jewish expression, and to see a dance form that reflected Israeli society. The Gaga dance approach has a loose structure, and it depends on everyone innovating. Only when each person interprets the general goal in a way that works for them and really puts in the effort does the dance come together. Needless to say, everyone slept very well that first night. Over the next few days, while exploring ancient mosaics, mystic mountaintop villages, and contemporary culture, we met many people who call Israel their home. Each one held strong opinions and wasn't shy about sharing what they thought. In the city of Lod, which is the second oldest city in the world, we met Nashua, an Arab Muslim woman who guided us through a museum exhibit. She was friendly, so we asked if she would speak with us informally after the tour. She agreed. After hearing her story, the teens asked her questions. Some of them were very frank, and she answered just as directly. Nashua expressed her concerns about where Palestinian leadership was taking her people. She also shared what it was like to be a minority in Israel and her frustrations with the inequalities and feeling like a second-class citizen. Parts of what she shared were uncomfortable for us, but we appreciated her honesty. On another occasion, we enjoyed the home hospitality of a young man named Rafa. He's part of the Druze people, another minority in Israel, many of whom proudly serve in the army and cherish Israel as a safe haven. He shared that the Muslim world has been harsh to the Druze, and thus they feel immense loyalty to the state of Israel. He also told our teens a bit about the Druze religion, most of which is a secret, and it centers around reincarnation. Our kids were fascinated. The next day, after snorkeling over the ruins of Caesarea, we went to Zikron Yaakov, a modern town built by Jewish pioneers. There we met with Ofer Eden, a veteran of the Yom Kippur War, who was severely wounded in the fighting, losing his right arm with partial damage to his left. Ofer shared how hard it was to adjust to his new reality as a young man. He looked our teens in the eye as he conveyed some of his darkest times, how he had found resilience and worked so hard to return not just to being alive, but to a life of meaning. We were deeply inspired. On another morning, we went to Israel's border with Syria to meet with Yaakov, who had not been home yet after having spent a week in the field doing maneuvers with his reserve army unit. We were standing on Tel Asaki, where 50 years ago, a Jewish platoon took a stand during the Yom Kippur War. The unit needed to hold strong and buy time for the rest of the Israeli army to mobilize against brigades of Syrian tanks. Almost all of the IDF soldiers died in that battle so that the country could survive the day. Yaakov then took us to an underground bunker, a maze of twists and turns in the dark, where today's IDF soldiers train to protect citizens against tunnel attacks. Hands on the shoulder in front of them, our teens were led through the maze and saw a glimpse of the IDF's training and trust. Perhaps the most tender exchange happened on a Friday, just hours before sundown. We brought Shabbos candles and cake to a small group of soldiers from a tank unit on the Lebanon border. Each of them introduced themselves and told us about their family, their brothers and sisters, where they lived, and where the family originated from. Every one of the soldiers was relatable. Keep in mind that these guys were only a year or two older than our teens, and when they shared their answers, mostly in translation, they came off not as macho, but as shy. Our teens were drawn to them. There was a real connection. It's hard to describe why, but when it was time to leave, there were hugs and tears from everyone. Personally, my heart went out to the parents of these soldiers who, knowing the risk, send their kids to the army in order to protect the Jewish people. We arrived in Jerusalem an hour before Shabbat began. We prayed at the Kotel with a sea of Jews who span the spectrum of Jewish religiosity, from strimals to crew cuts, from head covers to dreadlocks. And we relished in the delightful symphony of Jewish voices raised up in prayer. Shabbat morning, we attended an egalitarian Orthodox minyan, visited some of Christianity's most sacred sites, saw priceless works of art in the Israel Museum, and sang Havdalah together to bring this incredible day to a close. That evening, we participated in a peaceful demonstration. We wanted our teens to see democracy at work, and that it was both the right and the responsibility of every Jew to stand up for themselves and our vision of self-determination. Since January, there have been weekly protests all over Israel every Saturday night. The majority of the Israeli public are protesting against the current religiously extremist government that is legislating to curb women's rights, repeal gay rights, and change the definition of who is legitimately Jewish in the eyes of Israeli law. Primary on their agenda is to weaken the Supreme Court, which for decades has protected minorities and the rights of secular Jews. It's a complicated situation that personally pains me on a deep, deep level. When the founders of Ben-Gurion's generation reestablished the State of Israel in 1948, there was a premise that the country would always be Jewish, democratic, and pluralistic. That vision is now being challenged not from outside enemies, who are still a threat, but internally by her citizens. Right now, Israeli society is so divided that it's unclear how this fissure will get resolved. However, I know that Israel's been through a lot, and we Jews have been through even more. So I have faith in Israel as a democracy and its invigorated civic engagement to find a path forward. We took our teens to the demonstration because we wanted them to see that Israel is a complex society, just like America is a complex society. We wanted them to know that our relationship, love, and support for Israel is not with a particular elected government, but rather with her people, our people, even when times are hard. The snippets from this trip that I've shared with you can't possibly do justice to the existential lessons that we learned or the joys that we experienced together. We danced through the streets of Jerusalem, rejoicing in our place in its history. At Yad Vashem, we mourned our powerless past and learned the price of not having a country. And in the outdoor markets, we experienced the vibrancy of a living Jewish country, full of fruits and goods, movement and laughter, aromas and color, romance and energy. Perhaps the best way to describe our teens' experience isn't through my words, but through theirs. Many of their memories are recorded on our Temple Emanu-El website, but I want to conclude by sharing just one written by 16-year-old Laura Pollock. She writes, "My Israel trip seems impossible to explain to others. I never expected the overall impact that this trip would truly have on me forever. There were so many highlights, but I especially enjoyed feeling at home in this country, so far away from my other home. I never expected the genuine connection that I felt being in the country, and the people could not have been more welcoming. Because of this trip, I'm taking away true gratitude for Judaism, more than I ever have. This trip allowed me to feel really proud to be Jewish. And the ability to be so openly Jewish was such a weird but comforting feeling. Learning about the culture, and especially of the IDF, was so much more meaningful physically being there. I have such a different outlook and respect now after being in Israel, and I cannot wait to go back. Lech lecha, lechi lach. We're told, take yourself inward on a journey of self-discovery and deep spiritual connection to our past and to our future, to our history and to our destiny, towards what it means to be part of a people and to tap into our collective soul, to travel forward, and in doing so, to be a blessing. Our next Schiffer Teen Israel adventure is June of 2025. Our cup runneth over. Shana Tova.